Imagine standing on the brink of a promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, yet shadowed by the presence of towering giants. In Numbers chapter 13, verses 28 to 33, 12 spies return from scouting Canaan, trembling as they declare, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." These formidable beings are the Anakim, descendants of the mysterious Nephilim mentioned earlier in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, described as heroes of old, men of renown. Towering figures, so imposing they struck fear into seasoned warriors, enemies so formidable that even the bravest scouts felt dwarfed in their shadow. No welcomes, no slow build-up, just a stark realization. In ancient Canaan, the Israelites faced a clan known as the Anakim, a race of giants who challenged their destiny. Who were these Anakim? How did they rise to prominence in the biblical narrative? And what do we really know about them, beyond the often fragmented textual clues? Let's dive headfirst into the evidence, quickly, directly, and with precise detail, to unravel one of the most enduring mysteries of the Hebrew Bible. The Anakim appear as a powerful presence in the Old Testament, primarily associated with the land of Canaan. The very name Anak carries the idea of long-necked or tall. And it's no coincidence that these people were distinguished by their remarkable height and stature. Throughout the biblical narrative, the Anakim are identified as giants, not in a metaphorical sense, but as physically towering beings who caused fear and trepidation among those who encountered them. Our earliest and perhaps most pivotal mention comes from the reconnaissance mission recorded in the book of Numbers. Moses sends out 12 spies to survey the promised land before the Israelite conquest. The spies return with a mixed report. They confirm the land is rich, flowing with milk and honey, but 10 of them describe a terrifying obstacle. Its inhabitants include the sons of Anak. They declare, "We saw the Nephilim there. We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them." Here, the Anakim are not only giants, but are tied to the Nephilim, mysterious beings mentioned earlier in Genesis, often understood as giants born from unions between divine beings and human women. This direct link gives the Anakim a mythical aura. The spies frame the Anakim as insurmountable foes, larger-than-life warriors who make the Israelites feel insignificant. But who are the Anakim beyond this dramatic scene? Later texts in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 10 to 11, and Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 2 provide more clues. Deuteronomy references a people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, reinforcing their extraordinary height and might. Deuteronomy offers a comparative angle. It mentions that the Emim, another ancient giant people, were like the Anakim. Similarly, the Rephaim, yet another race of giants, are compared to them. This repetition and cross-referencing among giant clans suggests that the Anakim were part of a broader ancient Near Eastern tradition of giant peoples. They were not a singular anomaly, but one example of a consistent giant motif that appears in the region's folklore and tribal memory. By the time we reach the book of Joshua, the narrative focuses on the Israelite conquest of Canaan under Joshua's leadership. Joshua chapter 11, verses 21 to 22, describes a decisive event. Joshua and the Israelites cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah and Israel, leaving none except in the regions of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. This suggests that while the Anakim were significantly diminished, they were not entirely exterminated. Some remnants escaped to Philistine territories along the coast. Curiously, Gath would later produce Goliath, the giant who challenges Israel's future King David. While the text doesn't explicitly call Goliath an Anakite, the hint that Anakim survived in Gath could offer a subtle connection, at least thematically, linking later giant figures back to the Anakim line. But what do we make of their towering stature? Were the Anakim literally giants, or does the Bible use hyperbole? In a pre-modern context, describing enemies as giants could serve multiple narrative functions. It might represent their military might, fortified cities, advanced weaponry, or simply the terror they inspired. On the other hand, we have no strong reason to assume the biblical authors were speaking purely metaphorically. The consistent portrayal of giants throughout various biblical books suggests a long-standing tradition. If their size was an exaggeration, it was a deeply entrenched one, likely simply reflecting collective memory or folklore. The question of actual height remains unresolved. Without archaeological evidence of extraordinarily large human remains tied specifically to the Anakim, we can't confirm they were literally 8, 9, or 10 feet tall. But the biblical authors certainly believed, or wanted their audience to believe, that these people were imposing giants. From an archaeological standpoint, direct evidence of the Anakim as a distinct ethnic group or lineage is elusive. The material culture of ancient Canaan reveals numerous city-states, a patchwork of peoples, and various encounters between them. But inscriptions or records identifying a group as Anakim have not surfaced. This is not unusual. Many biblical peoples leave minimal direct archaeological evidence. Much of our knowledge depends on correlating biblical references with the broader archaeological and historical context of the Late Bronze and Early Iron Age in the Levant. The Anakim are mentioned in conjunction with cities like Hebron, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the region. Hebron was indeed a significant urban center. If the Anakim held it, they controlled strategic highlands with strong defenses. Their reputation for stature might reflect the memory of formidable warriors who once dominated the area. To understand the Anakim better, consider the cultural environment. The ancient Near East was replete with stories of giant beings, divine or semi-divine heroes, monstrous opponents, and larger-than-life warriors. The Bible itself, although uniquely monotheistic and with its own theological framework, emerged from and interacted with this cultural milieu. The references to Anakim, Rephaim, and Nephilim echo traditions found in neighboring cultures. For instance, ancient Ugaritic texts reference giant-like beings and semi-divine heroes, and Mesopotamian mythology includes giant figures too. These stories often serve to explain phenomena, justify land claims, or enhance the status of a people by demonstrating their victory over monstrous foes. Within this environment, it's not surprising that the Israelites, compiling their own historical and theological narrative, would record encounters with giant peoples. The Anakim also play a crucial literary and theological role in the biblical story. The Israelites' fear of these giants in numbers contributes to a pivotal narrative moment. The people's panic leads to rebellion against Moses and a lack of faith in God's promise. This, in turn, results in the famous punishment. The generation that left Egypt is condemned to wander the wilderness for 40 years, never entering the promised land. The Anakim thus become symbols of doubt and fear, literal giants standing between the Israelites and their divine inheritance. Later, when Joshua and Caleb do face the Anakim and overcome them, it's presented as a testament to faith and God's providence. The Anakim narrative shows that what once seemed impossible, overcoming giant adversaries, becomes possible through obedience, faith, and divine favor. In a sense, the Anakim serve a dual purpose. Historically or semi-historically, they represent a particular indigenous Canaanite group noted for their height and military prowess. Theologically, they represent insurmountable obstacles, testing whether the Israelites trust in their God or surrender to fear. This dual purpose is not unusual in biblical accounts, where historical events are often imbued with spiritual meaning. For ancient readers, the Anakim's defeat symbolized the triumph of God's covenant promises. For modern interpreters, the Anakim add depth and complexity, challenging us to discern fact from symbol, history from hyperbole. Another angle worth exploring is the linguistic and genealogical hints. The term Anakim is plural. They are said to be descendants of Anak, identified in Numbers as inhabitants of Hebron. Sometimes the biblical text mentions the sons of Anak, implying a lineage rather than just a tribe name. This suggests the authors envisioned a genealogical continuity, as if these giants came from a notable ancestor. The text also ties them loosely to the Nephilim, who appear in Genesis before the flood. This is intriguing. It suggests a continuity of giant lineages across cataclysmic events, implying that these giant peoples were not just a one-time phenomenon. From a narrative standpoint, connecting the Anakim to the Nephilim heightens the drama. The Nephilim were considered offspring of divine beings and human women, ancient, formidable, and morally ambiguous. By linking Anakim to them, the narrative suggests the Anakim carry on that terrifying legacy. Critical scholarship on the Anakim ranges widely. Some scholars argue for a kernel of historical truth, perhaps a regionally known clan of exceptionally tall warriors, or a population known for physical prowess. Human height varies across regions and ethnic groups, and it's plausible that certain communities were taller than others, especially when viewed by outsiders. In a world without precise measurements and genetic studies, even a few inches of difference might lead to a reputation for giant stature, especially when coupled with intimidating military military strength. Other scholars propose that the Anakim fit into a broader narrative technique. The biblical writers, influenced by ancient Near Eastern storytelling, used giants as a literary device to symbolize formidable foes. The lack of concrete extra-biblical references to the Anakim leaves both options open. When we look for similar accounts outside the Bible, we find numerous ancient myths and legends describing giants. The Greek titans and gigantes, for instance, or the giant kings in other traditions, parallel the biblical concept of formidable, superhuman adversaries. While it's risky to draw direct lines from Greek myth to Hebrew scripture, the motif of giants is so widespread in human storytelling that it suggests a universal fascination or cultural memory of massive, imposing enemies. The Anakim fit neatly into this universal pattern. Their presence in the biblical narrative could reflect a shared ancient worldview that accepted giants as part of the landscape of the distant past. Another question: why emphasize giants? In a theological sense, giants dramatize the gap between human weakness and divine strength. If the Anakim were impossibly huge, their defeat by the Israelites, through God's help, becomes a powerful demonstration that the God of Israel transcends even the greatest natural obstacles. The Anakim thus highlight the central biblical theme: trust in God surpasses any human advantage, no matter how physically imposing. At the same time, the presence of giants intensifies the narrative stakes. A land filled with normal-sized enemies is dangerous but manageable. A land filled with giants, on the other hand, pushes the narrative into a realm of near-mythic difficulty. When the Israelites finally prevail, their victory is that much more meaningful. From a historical critical perspective, the authors and redactors of these texts lived centuries after the events they describe. Stories about giants could have been part of older oral traditions. By the time these traditions were written down, memory and myth may have blended. The editors of the biblical texts preserved these giant tales, not necessarily because they had contemporary evidence for giant races, but because these stories were deeply ingrained in the cultural consciousness of Israel. They had explanatory power, symbolic weight, and dramatic flair. The Anakim narrative wasn't just a historical footnote, it was a meaningful piece of Israel's identity and theology. It's also worth considering how modern readers approach such texts. In a scientific age, readers often ask, where's the proof? We have no direct archaeological remains, no gigantic human bones confirmed from the relevant periods and places. We have no inscriptions by the Anakim themselves. Without external corroboration, some readers lean toward symbolic interpretation. Others maintain that just because we haven't found evidence doesn't mean they didn't exist. The absence of proof doesn't equal proof of absence, but it does place the Anakim, at least from a historical standpoint, in a somewhat ambiguous category. They remain figures we know primarily from biblical narrative tradition. Yet, the Anakim's legacy persists. Their mention in sermons, scholarly debates, and literature keeps them alive in the cultural imagination. They stand alongside the Nephilim, Rephaim, and other biblical giants as intriguing puzzles. Each generation of readers and scholars re-examines their story, bringing new frameworks to interpret these ancient texts. Some look to anthropology and consider whether tales of giants could have sprung from encounters with people suffering from gigantism or other conditions. Others look to comparative literature and find parallels that clarify how biblical authors structured their stories. Still others examine the theological significance, focusing on what these accounts teach about fear, faith, and divine promise. Consider also the Anakim's role in justifying Israelite claims to the land. By portraying the land's original inhabitants as fearsome giants, the narrative heightens the heroism of Israel's conquest. It also underscores the idea that Israel didn't choose the easiest path. They confronted genuine threats and overcame them. Whether the Anakim were truly colossal or not, their portrayal as giants underlines the notion that claiming the promised land required divine intervention. This ideological layer is crucial for understanding why the text emphasizes their intimidating nature. It communicates that Israel's presence in the land wasn't mere political happenstance. It was an event orchestrated by the God who can topple giants. In sum, the Anakim are a multifaceted element of the biblical narrative. On one hand, they represent a line of giant warriors with possible historical roots, a people so tall and intimidating that the Israelites nearly lost heart. On the other hand, they are literary and theological constructs woven into a narrative that demonstrates God's supremacy and faith's triumph over fear, while the exact height and historical reality of the Anakim remain uncertain. What is certain is their enduring impact on our understanding of the biblical world. They remind us that ancient texts blend history, myth, theology, and cultural memory into complex tapestries of meaning. For the Anakim, that tapestry consists of a few key biblical mentions, scattered connections to other giant clans, and a role in shaping Israel's collective identity as a people who overcame impossible odds. The Anakim thus stand tall, not just in stature, but in their importance to the narrative, theological, and symbolic world of the Hebrew Bible. Ultimately, we cannot fully separate fact from legend with the Anakim. We can't definitively say they were a distinct ethnic group or a legendary embellishment, but we can affirm that the Anakim mattered enough to be remembered as obstacles that tested Israel's courage and faith. Their legacy endures in modern discussions and debates as scholars, believers, and curious readers keep returning to the text, searching for clues about who the Anakim really were. The Anakim were described as giants, descendants of Anak, part of Canaan's ancient population, and a source of terror for the Israelites. They were linked to the Nephilim, lived in fortified cities like Hebron, and were eventually driven out by Joshua's forces, surviving only in the coastal regions of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. They exemplify the height of military and physical intimidation, setting the stage for stories of profound faith and divine intervention. And while we may never uncover a definitive archaeological record verifying their existence, the Anakim's narrative significance is beyond dispute. These giants, real or perceived, shaped the biblical world and continue to intrigue us today.